stop carrying the weight of lost friendships, a Zen story on letting go. A heavy, dull, and profoundly exhausting ache is settling into the very center of your chest right now, leaving your throat tight and your ribs feeling strangely hollowed out in the dark. You are lying perfectly still, yet your mind is restlessly pacing the perimeter of a long-ended friendship, a sudden social fracturing, or an unresolved drifting apart that left you completely without closure. There is a dense, cold knot of confusion in your upper body, a quiet internal friction that reactivates. Whenever you remember the shared plans that simply stopped, the warmth that cooled into absolute silence, or the painful realization that you have been left behind or forgotten by an old companion. Your breathing is shallow and restricted, caught behind an armored wall of defense, because your nervous system is still actively carrying the heavy loops of a loyalty that has nowhere left to land. The exhausting habit of mentally archiving what went wrong has left you feeling discarded, split down the center, and deeply isolated in your current environment. Let the specific, damp, and grounding atmosphere of this quiet room begin to absorb the smoldering confusion within your heart. The air surrounding your bed does not carry the typical warmth of a crowded house. Instead, it is infused with the deep, grounding sense of wet forest loam, decaying plum bark, and the rich, protective aroma of damp leaf mold turning over under a dense canopy of old hornbeams. Beneath your body, the mattress provides a wide, fertile floor, a dense and unyielding baseline that has absolutely no need for an external echo or an old companion's validation to maintain its complete stability. This surface offers a permanent sanctuary that is perfectly designed to take your entire weight, removing the requirement to look healed, socially secure, or over the loss for the eyes of the world. Right now, dear friend, you are safe enough to soften into this protective shadow. You are not broken because you still grieve an unraveled connection. And the heavy emptiness you are navigating tonight is not a personal failure. It is simply the natural, dense accumulation of a heart that has been forced to stay rigid to protect its history. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and you do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Consider a profound, comforting paradox that lies at the very center of this social dislocation. The agonizing tightness you are feeling right now is not actually caused by the vacancy your old friend left behind. We are conditioned to believe that our current peace depends entirely on achieving an explicit resolution, receiving a late explanation, or forcing the other person to understand the depth of our loyalty. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that the dull ache we feel at night is not the distant echo of the separation itself, but the active, continuous contraction of our own internal fibers trying to maintain a bond that has already finished its season. The suffering is the muscle memory of the grip, the internal strain that continues to hold up a ghost partnership long after the companion has walked away. The moment you stop trying to keep that dead root alive through sheer personal willpower and allow your uncarved mass to drop flat into the damp soil of reality, you discover that your spirit possesses an independent, sovereign stability that can rest securely in the dark without needing an external echo to remain whole. Maybe you have felt this too during the long dark hours of the evening, the relentless looping necessity to review old conversations, combined with a heavy guilt that tells you that if you cannot achieve an absolute state of unbothered indifference, you are permanently damaged and discarded. We treat our broken friendships like an active structural failure, spending our night hours replaying the moments where the alignment shifted, measuring the unfairness of the silence, and trying to fix ourselves through a secondary layer of self-reproach. This defensive posture only adds an exhausting psychological weight to the genuine raw hurt of a lonely heart. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the cool, damp air fill the very base of your diaphragm, moving beneath the tight knot in your sternum, entering the quiet, unmoving mass of your lower body. You do not need to force any immediate transformation right now, and absolutely nothing is required of you to be held safely by the earth. Imagine leaving behind the loud, competitive social circles of the lower valley and stepping into the dark, fern-choked mountain hollow, where the old hornbeams screen out the noise of the world completely. In this subterranean sanctuary, massive, Heavy rounds of wild plum wood rest undisturbed in the thick leaf mold under the dense forest canopy. They are not being aggressively carved, pinned, or forced into a functional shape. While green, they are simply placed directly into the cool, dark earth, allowing the natural slow moisture of the forest floor to soften their tough, twisted exterior grain without cracking the heartwood. There are no expectations here, no social contracts for you to maintain tonight, and no old identities for you to manually stitch back together in the dark. There is only the cool, mineral patience of the forest floor and the immense peace of a realm that knows how to hold an isolated form without demanding that it lean upon another. You have arrived at a baseline where you can finally drop the burden of your relationship history, stepping into a sensory world that allows you to trade the frantic panic of an omission for the heavy, horizontal safety of an independent night. Deep within a fern-choked hollow where the ancient hornbeams wove a dense ceiling over the mountain soil, the air remained perpetually cool, tasting of wet earth and slow-aging timber. In this quiet refuge lived a young woodcarver named Hiroshi. For years, Hiroshi had worked in perfect tandem with his closest companion, sharing a workshop in the valley below where their tools had moved with a matching cadence. But a sudden, quiet fracturing had split their path. His partner had left without explanation to join a rival guild, leaving their shared projects abandoned and the old workspace cold. Hiroshi had carried that silence up into the high woods like a physical splinter beneath his ribs, his body locked in a chronic defensive tension as his mind restlessly replayed their final season together. Whenever he picked up a chisel, his fingers would grip the iron too fiercely, forcing his will onto the grain until the delicate plum wood split in his hands. His work had become a sequence of jagged fractures, because his muscles were still executing the movements of a partnership that no longer existed. Seeking to soothe the dull ache that kept him awake into the midnight hours, Hiroshi sought out Master Toru, an elderly hermit who lived in a low timber shelter built directly over the damp leaf mold. Toru was a silent carver who rarely used a mallet, preferring to let raw logs sit undisturbed in the dark soil for multiple seasons before even touching them with a blade. The workspace smelled richly of damp moss, decomposing plum bark, and cold forest loam. The old master moved with an unhurried density, never rushing a cut or forcing a curve, treating every block of wood as a complete and sovereign presence, long before it took a recognizable shape. One evening, as the autumn mist began to drip from the low hornbeam leaves, Hiroshi sat by the cold stone threshold, his throat tight with the weight of his unraveled history. He confessed to Tora the deep confusion of his solitary work, replaying the loops of his loyalty, the suddenness of the abandonment, and the agonizing late-night habit of wondering why his companionship had been so easily discarded. He asked the old master how to make his grip precise enough to force the wood to stop splitting, or how to build a mental wall that would prevent the silence of his former friend from hollowing out his vital energy. Toru did not offer a philosophical lecture. Instead, he reached down into a dark trench beneath his workbench and pulled out a knotted piece of dry wild vine twisted around an old fragment of root bark. The vine was a rough, brittle loop of organic matter that had grown around a fallen sapling years ago, constricting its own fiber until it formed a tight, calcified knot. Even though the original sapling had long since rotted away, leaving only a dry sliver of root bark inside, the vine still maintained its fierce, strangling curve, its surface rough with gray scale, its shape so unyielding that it cracked slightly under the mere pressure of the damp air. Toru placed this knotted object directly into Hiroshi's tense palms and gestured for him to unravel it without breaking the wood. Hiroshi wedged his thumbs into the center of the twist and pulled with all his strength, his forearms locking and his jaw clenching as he tried to force the brittle loop into a straight line. But the moment his maximum effort met the wood, a sharp snap echoed through the quiet hollow. The dry vine split across its grain, splintering into useless, jagged shards that bit into his skin. "Observe the grain," Toru whispered, his voice low and dense, like a heavy stone sliding into wet soil. The elder carver took the broken fragments from Hiroshi's hands and carried them over to a deep, mossy clearing where the leaf mold lay thick and undisturbed beneath the ferns. Without using any force, Toru laid the split vine flat upon the damp, cool earth, nestling it deep into the soft velvet moss where the natural moisture of the forest floor could envelop its edges. The old master pointed to a massive round of wild plum wood that had been resting in that same damp hollow for 3 winters, its bark dark and soft with moisture, its interior grain completely relaxed without a single crack along its heartwood. Toru looked into Hiroshi's tired eyes and asked a single quiet question that cut straight through his defensive architecture. Did the vine break because its fiber was flawed, or because it was still trying to maintain the shape of a grip after the tree it leaned on had already disappeared? Hiroshi looked down at the fragments resting in the moss, comparing the relaxed, heavy round of plum wood to the rigid, protective posture he had maintained in his own chest for months. He realized that the agonizing stiffness in his upper body was not a sign of his enduring loyalty, but the calcified residue of his own resistance to the reality of the change. The vine had not broken out of unworthiness, it had broken because it was forced to bend while carrying the rigid structural memory of an old bond. The pain he carried every night was not the absence of his friend, but the continuous, exhausting strain of his own mind trying to hold up an empty partnership through the sheer willpower of resentment. But the plum block at his feet was entirely stable, whole, and unyielding precisely because it had dropped the effort to fight the damp earth. A profound wave of emotional recognition loosened the cold knot behind Hiroshi's ribs, allowing his breath to sink into his lower abdomen for the first time since the valley workshop had closed. He saw that his entire internal struggle had been an impossible attempt to force a discarded connection back into alignment through the velocity of overthinking, believing that if he stopped replaying the loss, his value as a craftsman would vanish entirely. He had treated his hardness as a necessary shield, completely blind to the reality that his own presence was already wide enough and grounded enough to absorb the silence of his companion without losing its native integrity. He did not need an explanation from the valley to become soft. His baseline was restored the moment he allowed his history to drop flat into the damp loam of the forest floor. The mountain twilight was sealing the fern-choked hollow in an absolute uniform shadow. Now the cold night breeze moving quietly through the hornbeam leaves without shaking their branches, the clean, earthy scent of the decomposing bark, and the wet moss hung suspended in the heavy air, drawing Hiroshi's attention entirely away from the old archives of his grief. Take a slow horizontal breath, letting your own ribs soften into the deep baseline of your bed, allowing your nervous system to rest upon the cool, silent soil as it settles into the quiet dark of the night. This old story from the fern-choked hollow is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding timber, or entirely numb to the very real ache of navigating a fractured connection or a sudden social betrayal. It is not an instruction to lock your heart away in a dark, frozen shed, pretending that the cold indifference of a companion or the sudden silence of an old friend does not leave a genuine, throbbing bruise across your personal history. It is showing us something much quieter, a profound shift in our internal posture that allows us to inhabit our independent life without letting it become an object of constant, exhausting emotional reconstruction. When we sit in the dark and look at our late-night friendship grievances, we begin to see that the deep, suffocating exhaustion we carry does not actually stem from the distance between our current life and our old social circle. The true suffering, the knot that contracts your chest and turns your sleep into a trial, resides not only in what happened when you were cast aside, but in the specific way the mind continues to hold the defense long after the companion has walked away. In our modern inner lives, what we call attachment is that frantic, hypervigilant urge to force our current presence into a rigid scaffolding that will guarantee our safety from the threat of further abandonment. It is the desperate craving to extract an explanation from a ghost, a silent belief that if we can just brace our life layout against an imaginary vindication, we will finally be safe from the cold winds of isolation. This craving operates exactly like a stiff wild vine pulling against its own fibers, continually straining our vital energy through endless loops of psychological review, believing that if we remain hyperconscious of the friend's injustice, we can prevent future hurt. We become like a craftsman who spends his vital nighttime hours frantically trying to straighten a calcified knot with his bare hands, completely blind to the reality that trying to maintain an unnatural resistance is what truly breaks our structural capacity to rest. The ancient insights of Buddhist wisdom help us stop adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is the baseline vulnerability that life brings to our emotional architecture, the sudden drift, the unexplained fracture, the heavy realization that a shared dream could not survive the changing seasons, or the simple truth that human relationships are subject to the same erosion and flaws as any organic system. These moments are painful, and they leave a real stinging heat across our awareness. The second wound, however, is the massive edifice of personal shame, chronic resentment, and Latin night trial scenes that we build around that initial vacancy. It is the secondary spiral where the mind convinces us that if we stop holding up the shield or analyzing the betrayal for even a single hour, we are accepting total defeat and letting the abandonment win. This continuous saturation of our own self-worth in the brine of old rejection is what truly depletes our body, trapping our nervous system in a permanent alarm that refuses to let the muscles soften. When we practice true mindfulness within our somatic self, we are simply learning how to view our history through a cool, non-judgmental awareness. This awareness is the quiet, grounding quality of the mind that can notice the burning heat of a social grievance without choosing to step directly into the habit of self-loathing or counterattack. It is the capacity to feel the tight contraction in your ribs or the heavy lock in your throat and say, "There is a dense point of vulnerability here in my frame," rather than, "I must aggressively change the past before I am worthy of entering the quiet." By shifting our relationship with this old hurt, letting go ceases to mean passive approval of mistreatment or forgetting what happened to us. Instead, letting go becomes an act of immense, quiet sovereignty, the willingness to step back from the old workshop, allowing your hardened identity to drop flat into the damp, fertile leaf mold until the frantic urge to argue stops vibrating through your limbs. Impermanence, when felt deeply within the organic reality of the body, becomes a source of profound relief rather than a cause for dread. Every human contract, every conventional tie of loyalty, and every high-profile role we were forced to play during our companionship eventually loses its momentum, shifts its foundation, and yields to the changing earth. The social configurations that seemed so permanent and terrifying during our shared youth are subject to the same decay as a piece of wild wood left out in the mountain weather. An old separation or a lack of closure cannot permanently destroy your internal integrity, unless you continuously pick up the hammer to pin your spirit to a disappearing wall. Wisdom reminds us that the most heavily armored and defensive characters quickly reveal their brittle nature when life shifts, while the heart that knows how to rest horizontally at the bottom of its own vast space remains entirely secure. Compassion, in this dark, earthy light, is the spacious clay that meets your emotional panic without turning your resentment into a source of personal failure. It is the willingness to look at the defensive, hardened part of your mind and recognize that this heavy loop of relationship review is not a defect in your spiritual character. It is simply a tired, primitive part of your survival biology that has been staying awake to protect your borders, believing that if it stops criticizing your history, you will be left entirely exposed to the coldness of the world. By meeting this internal builder with a slow, heavy, and completely unbothered physical presence, you allow the frantic necessity to defend yourself to dissolve, transforming the brittle desire for an explanation into a dense, grounding mineral weight. In a moment, this horizontal clarity will move from an idea you listen to into a concrete physical practice you can truly drop your entire weight into. The crisp, damp air within our quiet forest hollow remains perfectly still, totally unconcerned with the grand emotional displays of the lower valley. The aging woodblocks hold their immense mass in absolute, dignified silence, allowing the dark leaf mold to soothe their fibers without any need to justify their position to a passerby. Take another slow, intentional breath, letting the hot static in your temples sink flat into the mattress as we prepare to guide the mind into a much deeper state of physical relaxation. If it feels right, Allow the physical boundaries of your body to sink fully into the level surface that supports you tonight, surrendering your entire somatic weight into the quiet foundation below. There is no need to engineer an artificial stillness within your mind, nor is there any requirement to alter the simple, automatic cadence of your breathing as it moves quietly across your lips. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool, damp air entering your lungs, unhurried and deep, leaving a subtle trace of wet stone and decaying bark as it exits your frame. With each slow horizontal exhalation, you might allow the sharp edges of your jaw, your shoulders, and the small, hypervigilant muscles around your ribs to lose their tight configurations. Imagine your physical self sinking down into the dense, dark baseline of the mattress, dropping the defensive posture of the day completely, like a hardened woodblock that has finally been laid flat inside a deep, cool mountain hollow filled with rich forest loam. As you lie here in the deep shadow of your room, you might shift your internal focus away from the vertical, straining territory of the temples and the forehead, allowing your center of gravity to settle deep into the base of your hips. For many hours, your vital energy has been pulled upward into a hot, vibrating knot of social grievance, tensing like fibers under a heavy strain as you tried to manually defend your history against the ghosts of a broken friendship. Right now, there is no need to force that momentum to vanish, instantly even noticing the faint, rhythmic expansion of your lower abdomen as it rises and falls is entirely enough to anchor you to the ground. You do not have to perform this meditation perfectly to prove your emotional resilience to an invisible judge. There is no score being kept in this hornbeam forest, no penalty for carrying an unpolished past, and absolutely nothing you are required to fix before you are permitted to drop your effort into the dark. In this open, non-judgmental space of your own awareness, you might allow one specific, recurring thought or memory from your unraveled connection to appear without trying to fight its presence. Perhaps it is a sudden silence that left you feeling completely excluded, an unexplained departure that hardened your heart, or a persistent urge to stay awake to mentally settle an old account with an old companion. Do not try to aggressively push this memory out of your head, and do not dive into its details to argue with the characters in your imagination tonight. Instead, if it feels right, you can name the emotional pattern softly to yourself, perhaps using the silent words holding the shield, gripping the dead root, or bracing the wall. Recognizing the habit in this gentle way is enough to create a small, cool distance between your core self and the heat of the resentment. Once you have named the pattern, you might imagine taking that entire, burning narrative and placing it gently into the fractured center of the stiff, brittle wild vine that sits in the dark trench of the mountain shelter. Let the hardened, calcified loop hold the entire weight of that friendship grievance for you. In your imagination, you can reach down and touch that rough, unyielding surface chilled by the subalpine air, smelling of ancient earth, and completely detached from the emotional demands of the valley workshop. Gently, without any sense of anger or violence, you might allow your awareness to merge with that resting object, letting your self-image rest directly upon its unmoving, flat position at the bottom of the mossy hollow. There is no need to force a sudden catharsis, or to demand that your mind instantly forgive the injury. You are simply allowing the frantic necessity to defend your history to drop flat against the bedrock. Watch what happens to that image when you stop feeding the memory with the fresh energy of your overthinking. You might notice that as you leave the worry resting within the heavy, dark depths of the wet leaf mold, the erratic, straining tension of your analytical habits naturally begins to lose its velocity. The cool, dense earth does not fight the bitterness, it outlasts it, holding your presence perfectly still within a dark, self-contained realm of forest clay until the volatile anxiety naturally runs out of momentum. The urgent necessity to change your former friend's perspective begins to dissolve, replaced by the deep, horizontal density of a frame that is far too grounded to be broken by an omission. The mind stops pulling against the old exclusion and begins the quiet, slow process of settling into an unshakable baseline of inner peace. If your mind occasionally drifts back into its old habit of drafting defenses, or if a sudden wave of social grief surfaces around your collarbones, remember that you can return to the cool, grounding texture of your breath whenever you are ready. There is no timeline you must follow tonight, and no one is asking you to promise your nervous system a state of permanent, immediate healing. True transformation does not happen by violently erasing your natural vulnerability, but by realizing that your awareness is like the vast, subterranean forest hollow itself, capacious enough to let the raw materials rest safely in the dark without needing to straighten them by force. Let each slow, unhurried breath feel like the natural grounding of a weight, allowing your limbs to become heavy, porous, and completely unresponsive to the urgent static of the daytime world. In a moment, our journey will return to the timber workspace, following Hiroshi as the seasons shift and bring an unexpected encounter that will test the true stability of his uncoiled heart. The deep, dark textures of the old hermit's clearing will continue to open a path toward an absolute, indestructible form of inner sovereignty. For now, simply allow yourself to remain right here, unmoving and encased in this protective shadow, letting each breath sink you an inch deeper into the vast, horizontal safety of the night. 2 winters had passed across the high ridges, burying the mountain paths under massive drifts of frozen white shale, before the heavy northern gales finally locked the mountain shelter in an absolute, unmoving silence. Hiroshi spent his long, solitary nights working alongside the aging woodblocks, his hands slowly growing accustomed to the blunt, cool texture of the wet plum wood, his breathing gradually finding the steady, horizontal rhythm of the damp dirt floor below. One freezing afternoon, as a bitter sleet began to coat the hornbeam ceiling, the heavy oak doors of the mountain workshop creaked open, and a single traveler stumbled into the damp warmth of the room. It was Hiroshi's former companion, the very friend who had left the shared workspace without an explanation, whose face had remained the primary symbol of Hiroshi's late-night bitterness for many long seasons. The former friend did not look up immediately in the dim, smoky light of the room, his clothes soaked through from the alpine storm, his tools clattering loosely inside a worn leather sack. He had not come up the mountain to offer an apology, or to heal the old bond. He had simply been caught by the sudden blizzard while traveling to a lower town, and needed to retrieve a specific iron tool he had left behind years ago. The moment Hiroshi looked upon his former companion's face, his entire physical framework tightened with an intense reactive heat. The old social wound flared up with a searing force, tempting him to step forward and voice his anger, to refuse him shelter from the freezing sleet, or to demand the explanation he felt he was owed. The mind immediately began to spin a complex vindictive web of justifications, telling him that this sudden intrusion was his chance to force a confrontation and regain control over his past. Hiroshi's fingers gripped a dull, wide-bladed wood-splitting iron cleaver resting in the moss by his side. The cleaver was a heavy, unadorned tool that had rested in the damp leaf mold for seasons, its iron surface dark and smooth from constant exposure to the forest moisture. Touching that dense piece of metal brought an immediate somatic recollection of the plum rounds, resting flat on the earth, entirely free from the necessity of fighting the elements because they had already surrendered to the baseline. Hiroshi stood perfectly still in the center of the dark floor, his knuckles white against the wooden handle. Instead of allowing his reactive thoughts to dictate his movements, he chose one small, quiet act of discipline. He paused before speaking, took a single slow breath, and let the crisp, earth-scented air expand into the very base of his spine, allowing the hot thoughts of confrontation to sit on his surface like steam on cold rock without treating a single one of them as an absolute command. In that deliberate interval of physical stillness, a profound realization opened up within his framework, changing his relationship to his own history of social pain. He looked at his former friend, who was now clumsily searching through the corner of the shed with shaking, frozen fingers, and realized that he no longer needed to extract an apology to prove that his own life was complete. He saw that his companion was merely an other fragile piece of material being tossed about by the changing tides of the valley, constantly trying to navigate his own unpolished path through survival, fear, and silent transitions. Hiroshi stopped resisting the reality of the unraveled friendship, allowing the empty space of the partnership to exist without transforming it into a permanent definition of his own unworthiness. He did not pretend that the sudden departure had not hurt, but he stopped using that old injury as an excuse to keep his own heart locked in a tight, defensive knot. A wave of quiet, sovereign compassion moved through Hiroshi's chest, entirely independent of any desire for mutual closure. Without demanding a conversation or replaying the old grievances, he stepped forward, laid down the iron cleaver, and reached into the dark bin to pull out the old tool his friend had been searching for. It was a simple gouge, rusted by the damp air but still solid. Hiroshi wiped the condensation from the metal, held it out in silence, and then quietly moved back to his place by the hearth to stoke the embers, offering the traveler a seat near the heat without forcing an artificial reconciliation. He sat with the raw uncertainty of the silence, experiencing for the first time the deep internal equilibrium of a frame that rests entirely on its own foundation. The subalpine night was sealing the Hornbeam Hollow in an absolute uniform dark now, the howling wind outside the timber walls turning into a distant background murmur. The clean, grounding aroma of the wet leaf mold and the cold forest loam hung suspended in the heavy air, drawing Hiroshi's attention all the way down into the solid mass of his lower body. He had not achieved a state of magical, effortless perfection, and the memory of the loss still carried a cold weight during the long winter hours. But he had discovered how to let his history rest flat at the bottom of the hollow, without needing to hold up a shield for the world to admire. Take a slow, horizontal breath, letting your own ribs soften into this level mattress, allowing your awareness to rest upon the blunt, smooth face of the iron tool as it settles into the quiet depth of the night. This internal contraction we carry into the midnight hours is the direct result of a complex, unconscious preservation process that the mind mistakenly initiates to protect itself from the cold winds of interpersonal vulnerability. When an old friendship ends abruptly or a shared path fractures without an explanation, the immediate response of your nervous system is not to relax into the empty space of that missing validation, but to build an elaborate invisible armor of defensive calculations. You lie awake under the cover of the dark, your muscles locked into a rigid posture, while your intellect relentlessly rehearses future encounters and replays past conversations, trying to figure out exactly how the alignment shifted and who was responsible for the structural collapse. This continuous mental labor is a desperate, frantic bid for control and illusion, that if you can just analyze the relationship dynamics long enough, or hold your body tightly enough against the old hurt, you can somehow prevent your identity from dissolving into total ruin. We become deeply habituated to this state of internal resistance, eventually turning the localized pain of an abandonment into a permanent, defining identity. When a social betrayal occurs, the mind doesn't simply record the event as a changing shift in your personal history. It takes the bitter pieces and builds a monument of self-judgment in the center of your chest. You begin to define yourself as the discarded companion, the hardened material that was inherently unfit to keep an enduring partnership, or the person who is destined to remain perpetually saturated in the sour brine of rejection. To maintain this heavy identity, you are forced to treat every passing thought about your unworthiness as an absolute, undeniable truth, continually picking up the iron mallet of shame to chisel away at your own current baseline. We try to fix ourselves through self-reproach, believing that if we remain hyper-conscious of our perceived flaws, we are somehow earning our way back towards safety and approval. But the ancient, quiet clarity of Buddhist wisdom reveals that the true source of your midnight exhaustion is never the social history itself, but the specific way your mind has chosen to manage the wreckage. Every emotional disaster is composed of two entirely distinct layers. The first pain, which is the raw material that life drops into your clearing, and the second pain, which is the immense, suffocating framework that your thoughts add to the initial fracture. The first pain is the unvarnished reality of the breakage, the cold look, the unexplained departure, the empty space where loyalty should have been, or the blunt truth that human companions occasionally yield to their own hidden limitations and fears. This initial sting is an occurrence that moves through your timeline like a sudden freeze over a mountain creek. It leaves a real, stinging heat across your awareness, but it does not possess the capacity to permanently destroy your core pliability unless you choose to continuously re-immerse the tissue in the old loop. The second pain is the elaborate maze of psychological resistance, historical regret, and invisible trial scenes that you build around that empty space. The second pain is the voice that takes an old separation and transforms it into an absolute sentence of permanent isolation, telling you that because your old friend could not stay, your foundation is utterly ruined. We cannot always control the first pain, as life will occasionally shift the configurations of our social circle without asking for our consent. But we have the absolute capacity to stop feeding the secondary armor with our vital energy. Every time you notice your intellect spinning a brilliant, late-night defense, or rereading an old interaction to find a hidden meaning, and you choose instead to drop your attention straight down into the level weight of your lower ribs, you are starving the second pain of the oxygen it requires to keep your nervous system in a state of permanent alarm. True inner peace, when understood through this rugged forestry perspective, is never defined as the total absence of difficulty, loneliness, or relational change. It is not a state of magical numbness where you no longer care about the people who shared your youth, nor is it a pristine hall that is completely insulated from the storms of the valley. Peace is simply a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives. It is the capacity to feel the tight contraction in your ribs and the heavy lock in your throat and realize that your solitary framework is wide enough, deep enough, and patient enough to contain that raw energy without needing to build an imaginary bridge over the abyss to change the past. You treat your feelings of hardness as a command to fix the relationship immediately, and you begin to discover that your individual structure possesses its own central gravity, perfectly capable of balancing its own mass upon the unmoving architecture of the earth. By understanding this internal mechanism, you can finally grant yourself permission to step down from the watchtower and stop trying to solve the entire layout of your relationship history in a single night. You do not have to force your grief to vanish instantly, nor do you need to look for an immediate dramatic transformation to prove your spiritual worth to the world below. You can simply allow the empty space of your unraveled bond to exist as a quiet, unmeasured margin in the room, trusting that the natural, horizontal mass of your body is far too grounded to be shattered by an unwritten future. The heavy fibers of your structure are no longer straining toward an absent validation. They are dropping straight down, sinking into the deep, protective shelter of a baseline that requires absolutely no external prop to remain entirely whole. Let this horizontal clarity pass from an idea you analyze into a concrete, physical weight that anchors your entire frame to the mattress right now. The clean, damp aroma of the wet leaf mold and the cold forest loam within your room remains perfectly balanced, completely unaffected by the chaotic construction projects of the daytime world. Your bones are growing increasingly porous, heavy, and non-reactive, absorbing the deep shadow of the evening without a single condition or judgment. Allow your breathing to become quiet, slow, and horizontal, a soft tide moving through an interior landscape that has completely abandoned the exhausting habit of the shield, resting profoundly within the immense, self-contained safety of your own quiet night. This dark, absorptive leaf mold equilibrium is not an isolated concept designed to be locked away behind an old wooden wall or left entirely on the damp floors of a remote northern mountain shelter. True inner peace is practiced in the very small, unpolished friction points that make up the raw, demanding texture of your modern daily life. It is found in that exact second when you are lying awake at night, checking your phone for a glimmer of reassurance from an old friend, watching the small glass screen cast a cold, flickering glow across your bedroom ceiling, because an acknowledgement or an explanation has never arrived. In that moment, the old habit of your nervous system is to treat the digital silence as an absolute personal collapse, a signal that your individual worth has been permanently compromised, and that you must immediately draft a mental argument to fix the gap. True wisdom begins when you notice that frantic impulse, pause before touching the device, and realize that the delay does not decrease your own internal skeletal density by a single grain. We live in an accelerated culture that constantly demands we act like perfectly aligned, unblemished structures, presenting a smiling, symmetrical facade to our social circles, even when our interior framework feels heavy, lopsided, and filled with a thick smoke of unspoken grief. You might find yourself sitting through a long social gathering, smiling and cooperating automatically, while feeling completely heavy inside, or replaying a decades-old mistake you made during a sleepless night, because an unfair comparison still stings your ego. We look at the achievements of our old friends. We compare our private, uncarved struggles to their bright, geometric trajectories, and we instantly decide that we are falling hopelessly behind the conventional timeline of a successful life. The mind creates a false sense of absolute emergency, telling you that if you do not instantly fix your status, your loneliness, or your fractured relationship dynamics by tomorrow morning, you will be permanently excluded from safety. But a profound transformation occurs when you discover that not every frantic thought deserves your active obedience, and not every anxious feeling is an absolute command that requires a reaction. When you feel a sudden surge of social panic prompting you to write a searing reply, or force an immediate confrontation to gain control over a relationship, you can choose to simply sit with the raw texture of the uncertainty, rather than running to manipulate the situation. Taking a slow, heavy breath before answering a provocative message, or reacting to an unfair remark from an old companion, is a form of immense internal discipline. It is a way of demonstrating to your own body that you are no longer a fragile cord that will snap at the slightest pull of the wind. You can care deeply about the individuals in your past, without gripping their emotional approval so tightly that you fracture your own core. You can support them from a place of dense, self-contained mass, like a cool earth mound resting securely in the shadows, rather than as an overstrained wire waiting to be broken by a change in the weather. This also means that you are entirely permitted to drop into an absolute, deep rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless productivity or external validation. Many of us carry a heavy, silent guilt the moment our bodies try to soften, believing that if we are not actively building, planning, or resolving a conflict for our peers, we are failing. But your fundamental value as a living presence is not a commercial product that fluctuates based on how many social circles you managed to placate before the sun went down. You do not have to settle your entire relationship history before you are allowed to close your eyes. Nor do you need to apologize for seeking a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the lower valleys. Rest is not a luxury reserved for those who have achieved a perfect pattern of social harmony. It is the natural native right of a physical frame that belongs to the heavy, uncarved bedrock of the world. Let this independent perspective occupy your physical awareness right now as you lie beneath the heavy covers of your bed. When the memory of an old friendship exclusion or an unexplained departure tries to pull your attention back up into the hot, friction-filled air of overthinking, let the sheer weight of your bones serve as your anchor, pulling you straight down into the immediate dark. You can acknowledge that the difficult separation occurred without allowing it to dictate the shape of your current night. By choosing to let the memory sit on your surface beneath a thick, moist blanket of non-judgmental presence, you are gradually retraining your mind to understand that it is safe to step down from the scaffolding. In a moment, the final echoes of these modern applications will begin to cool down entirely, letting the teaching pass from language into pure, inert sleep. The space surrounding your bed is growing increasingly heavy, the dark air absorbing your presence without a single condition, measurement, or judgment. You do not need to hold a rigid design for anyone tonight. You are simply a loose, unknotted material, resting undisturbed in the deep shadows of the room, completely hidden, completely non-reactive, and absolutely safe in your own quiet night. The active, balancing friction of your thoughts is beginning to lose its draft now, cooling down into the quiet corners of the room, like a heavy layer of damp plum bark settling over a deep, dark forest floor when the long autumn storm has spent its energy. The absolute necessity to build a defense, the habit of tracking these historical social grievances, and the drive to fix your unraveled friendship can all be left behind on the mossy ground tonight. Your physical frame is becoming intensely weighted, dropping into the level support of the bedding with an immense, absolute gravity that cannot be countered by a restless childhood memory or a midnight calculation. The wide muscles of your lower jaw are entirely relaxed. Your throat is cool and spacious, and your ribs are blanketed by a dense, unreacting shade that has no desire to scan the dark for a missing explanation. Let the internal cadence of your pulse drop into a slow, grounding movement, sinking into the deep, unthreaded chamber that holds your independent rest. There is not a single relationship problem left for you to solve tonight. The busy administrative markets of the lower valley have been locked up from the inside. The erratic creaking of the old gates has stopped, and the voices that demanded you justify your loyalty have withdrawn into the shadows of the ravine. You do not have to take your friendship logistics, your social scores, or your defensive habits under the blankets with you. Let yourself slip entirely out of the heavy, rigid harness that you wore to navigate the friction of an old abandonment. You are entering a wide, quiet sanctuary where no arguments are pulled taut, no childhood roles are being appraised, and no one is calculating your value based on your visible presentation. The quiet atmosphere holds your skeleton with an absolute, unmoving security, treating your weariness as a natural, necessary return to the raw, uncarved baseline of the earth. Let your awareness sink all the way down into the heavy bones of your hips and spine, far beneath the high vertical structures where resentments are continually rehearsed. Imagine your entire presence as a soft, completely uncarved block filled with dense, cooling moisture, sinking slowly into the cool, dark comfort of an undisturbed layer of leaf mold. The world may continue to move in its own erratic rhythm, and the unpredictable valley may continue to vibrate on the surface. But down here on the damp earth, there is only a spacious, self-contained silence. You are resting on a foundation that is far too deep to be moved by the passing white scale of an old conflict. With each slow, unhurried exhalation, you are shedding the evolutionary urge to defend your space through constant mental labor. Let the heavy darkness of the night wrap around your shoulders like a protective, damp blanket of hornbeam shade, dampening every residual signal, cradling your tired chest in a permanent stillness. You have permission to abandon the watchtower now. You have permission to let the coming years remain completely unwritten, to drop the broad iron cleaver into the dirt, and to simply allow your consciousness to unwind into the solid density of the unconditioned dark. Gradually, the mind untethers itself from the necessity of an immediate validation, sliding out into a deep, vast landscape of sleep where no social patterns need to be manually held under tension. The breathing has turned into a slow, heavy, and horizontal tide, a soft expansion moving through an interior world that has completely forgotten the rhythm of the shield. You are safe here in the hidden hollow, completely unreacting, completely contained, and profoundly whole in your own uncoiled mass. If the tree you leaned on has already fallen to the ground, what are your roots still holding so tightly in the dark? The question dissolves into the deep, wet soil without demanding an answer, leaving only the quiet density of your own breathing as it moves in alignment with the slow, ancient pulse of the mountain forest. We pass our waking hours treating our sense of identity like a fragile, intricate piece of latticework that will completely vanish if it is not constantly anchored to another person's presence, continuously striving to keep an old form alive long after the season has shifted. But the true, indestructible reality of your presence tonight is that it cannot be permanently dismantled by a sudden silence, an unexplained departure, or the quiet collapse of a lifelong partnership. Your core being is the very ground upon which all these passing relational patterns arise, mature, and return to the earth a baseline of awareness that remains absolutely whole, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many workshops in the valley lie empty and cold. Consider how the massive rounds of plum wood, resting beneath the hornbeam canopy, do not grieve for the branches that were severed from their bark seasons ago. They do not look back at the shared growing years with a sense of personal failure. They do not argue with the wind that carried the pollen down into a different valley. And they do not worry whether their uncarved surfaces will ever be celebrated by the craftsmen below. They simply surrender their entire physical weight to the absolute stillness of the leaf mold, completely content to return to their native, horizontal state as sovereign pieces of heartwood. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting, nocturnal requirement to be an administrator of old loyalties, a perfect reflection of someone else's timeline, or a tireless rebuilder of a bond that has already finished its work. You can allow the external world to move in its own volatile currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be consumed by an empty space. Let this organic release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final, subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your collarbones and around the base of your throat. For many winters, your body has been conditioned to treat a sudden social fracturing or a lack of explicit closure as an immediate emergency that must be instantly managed through a mental review before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal rebuilding is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the disoriented thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into an artificial numbness. You can simply allow the vulnerability to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a life of flawless social execution or mutual alignment. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of replaying an old betrayal to find a different outcome, or of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those who left you behind, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no metric you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine sawdust drifting down into the cool, damp mountain clay. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of your past, the messages left waiting, the sudden exclusions, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay accepted by the crowd are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the forest hollow. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival, or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide horizontal presence, resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and heavy tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. The silence that follows this realization settles deep into the damp earth, moving past the level of words and theories, turning into a heavy, soothing weight that gently aligns your entire nervous system with the quiet floor of the forest hollow. We spend so much of our conscious lives treating our sense of inner peace like a delicate, intricate structural network that will completely fall apart if we do not constantly shield it from the changing weather, continuously striving to maintain an immaculate, symmetrical exterior for a world that loves to judge and compare. But the true, unyielding reality of your presence tonight is that it cannot be permanently warped by a casual omission, a sudden social fracturing, or the cold silence of an old companion. Your core being is the very ground in which all these passing relational adjustments gather, mature, and dissolve a space that remains absolutely dense, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many shared projects in the valley have returned to the dust. Consider how the massive rounds of wild plum wood resting beneath the dense hornbeam canopy do not retain the frantic vibration of the tools that shaped them during the spring. They do not argue with the damp leaf mold that covers their grain. They do not hold a grudge against the hand that cast them aside into the shade, and they do not worry whether their uneven texture will be celebrated by the craftsman tomorrow. They simply surrender their entire physical mass to the absolute stillness of the earth, completely content to return to their native horizontal state as sovereign pieces of the mountain forest. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of total non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting, nocturnal requirement to be an answer to every relational standard, an administrator of social outcomes, or a perfect reflection of someone else's aesthetic timeline. You can allow the external world to move in its own volatile currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be consumed by an unrecorded hour. Let this organic release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final, subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your collarbones and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, your body has been conditioned to treat an unresolved split or a moment of social isolation as an immediate emergency that must be instantly settled through a mental review before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the self-conscious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into a state of artificial silence. You can simply allow the vulnerability to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless execution or social validation. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no metric you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine sawdust drifting down into a quiet mountain stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of the past, the messages left waiting, the minor frustrations, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay accepted by the crowd, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the Hornbeam Hollow. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival, or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and heavy tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This absolute baseline of non-resistance requires no external verification or alignment, as it remains the permanent, unyielding foundation of your awareness, resting silently beneath the shifting memories of the day like the heavy, ancient stone roots supporting the entire mountain ridge. We spend our waking hours treating our sense of security like a delicate, unstable framework that will collapse if we do not constantly brace it against external approval, continuously striving to align our personal history with the changing opinions of a volatile world. But the true, indestructible reality of your presence tonight is that it cannot be dismantled by an empty space, an unreturned look, or a sudden change in another person's emotional weather. Your core being is the very clearing in which all these passing social configurations arise and dissolve a ground that remains absolutely dense, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many connections have returned to the quiet earth. Consider how the uncarved plumb block resting beneath the dark canopy does not retain the frantic vibration of the tools that worked around it during the spring. It does not argue with the damp leaf mold that covers its bark. It does not hold a grudge against the hand that left it in the shade. And it does not worry whether its uneven texture will be celebrated by the craftsman tomorrow. It simply surrenders its entire physical mass to the absolute stillness of the ground, completely content to return to its native horizontal state as a sovereign piece of mountain wood. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of total non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting, nocturnal requirement to be an answer to every relational standard, an administrator of social outcomes, or a perfect reflection of someone else's emotional timeline. You can allow the external world to move in its own unpredictable currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be fractured by an uncelebrated hour. Let this organic release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your ribs and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, your body has been conditioned to treat an unresolved split or a moment of social isolation as an immediate emergency that must be instantly managed through a mental review before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the self-conscious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into a state of artificial numbness. You can simply allow the vulnerability to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless execution or social validation. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of replaying an ancient argument to find a different outcome, or of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no metric you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine sawdust drifting down into a quiet mountain stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of your past, the messages left waiting, the sudden exclusions, the persistent whisper that your natural form is not doing enough to stay accepted by the crowd, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the Hornbeam Hollow. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival. or trying to force an apology out of an unpredictable lineage. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and heavy tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is.